This is Craig Brown, and welcome to Passages. Passages is a space to explore Bible passages used for preaching, reflection, and prayer. My hope is that Passages will shine a unique light on text used for preaching at the First Free Methodist Church in Seattle, Washington, or for anyone looking to dive deeper into the Bible. Today's passage is Mark chapter 8, verses 27 to 33. It's the basis for the sermon at First Free Methodist Church on Sunday, February 22nd, 2026. It's part of our series called Transforming Conflict: How We Can Hold Others in Life's Disruptions. So let's hear the text from verse 27 of Mark chapter 8. Jesus went out along with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he questioned his disciples, saying to them, "Who do people say that I am?" They told him, saying, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he continued questioning them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered and said to him, "You are the Christ." And he warned them to tell no one about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise from the dead. And as he was stating this matter plainly, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning around and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said to him, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on God's purposes, but on man's." Such an important passage of Scripture in Mark's Gospel, and so today we're going to be looking at this passage in two different segments, verses 27 to 30, which is a question of Jesus' identity, and then verses 31 to 33, which is a question of intention. So let's take a look at these first few verses, 27 to 30, before we continue in the text. This question of identity is before us. Now, Mark's story of Jesus' life takes it to the pivot point of the story in Mark chapter 8, and this very passage is the pivot point in Mark's gospel. In some ways, you can read Mark like a crescendo that begins in chapter 1 and leads us up to chapter 8. Everything to this point in the story focuses on Jesus' popularity in the Galilee, where he does most of his ministry. Now, everything after this story points toward the coming drama that is going to come in Jerusalem. Jesus convenes his disciples in the far north at the foot of Mount Hermon. Now, if you were to go there today, this is in the Golan Heights. It's just a few miles from the Lebanese border. Caesarea Philippi is so named after Herod. It's so named because after Herod the Great's death, his kingdom was kind of split up amongst a bunch of different people. And even then, they were all vassal kings in the Roman Empire. So it's not like these kings ruled completely. They were under Roman authority. And so the portion that was kind of to the north and to the east, where Caesarea Philippi was given to a relative of Herod the Great, Philip. And you probably know him in the Bible as Philip the Tetrarch, who assumed leadership. Now, Judea was under the direct authority of the Romans. So when Herod the Great died, they didn't get another Herodian king to replace Herod the Great. The Romans took complete authority over the region called Judea, and they were ruled by the Roman governor who had a residence at a different place called Caesarea Maritima, which is out on the Mediterranean coast. So, upon becoming a vassal king of the Roman Empire in the north, Philip, as a way of honoring Caesar, names this small city in the north, or town really, he named it after Caesar Augustus, who Philip was a vassal king for. And so Philip named it Caesarea, which is named it Caesarea for Caesar, and Philippi he named for himself. So the name Caesarea Philippi is Caesar and Philip. Now, there is a temple there today, if you go to Caesarea Philippi, to the Greek god Pan. And it's commonly understood that this little temple that's kind of nestled into the side of a little cliff there, it would be described within the Greek world as the gates of hell. And if you read this story that we read in Mark's gospel from other gospels, Jesus will there tell Peter that his name will now mean rock, and that the gates of hell will not prevail against his church. Well, the whole gates of hell concept makes sense because they're standing in front of what the pagans believe to be literally the gates of hell. So this area today has rushing streams that flow through it, which feed into the Sea of Galilee. And to the south, if you go there today, the streams are still there. They flow into Lake Kinneret, which is what the Sea of Galilee is called today, into the Jordan River, and then ultimately to the Dead Sea. But what's interesting about this place at Caesarea Philippi is it's in the foothills of Mount Hermon. So when you're up in Caesarea Philippi, you can look to the south and see if it's a clear day, you can see the land leading down to the Sea of Galilee, all of the Sea of Galilee, and down the Jordan River Valley, including the mountains up on the right where Jerusalem is. So as Jesus is having this conversation, the totality of his ministry is literally in view of the disciples. So it's really no wonder why this conversation happens at Caesarea Philippi. So it says on the way there, they were discussing a question with one another, and Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" So they respond with what they've heard and seen in all of the Galilean crowds. They say, well, some people say you're John the Baptist, who at that point was a prophet who was already dead. Some say that Jesus is Elijah, having returned, and this would be a prophet that they believed would come before the Messiah. You might remember the biblical story of Elijah, that Elijah did not die, but was rather assumed into heaven, the chariot of fire. And so there was this expectation amongst Jews that that same Elijah would return as a prophet to announce the coming of the Messiah. And then the disciples say, and other people say, you're one of the prophets. So Jesus could just simply be another new prophet, like many regarded John the Baptist to be. Then Jesus changes the frame of the question, and he says, but who do you say that I am? Now, the disciples are asked to make their own response to this question. Based on what they themselves have seen and heard, what conclusion would they draw? What the text tells us is that Peter is the one who gives an answer. He says, you are the Christ. Now, Christ, the Greek word Christos, is the Greek word for anointed one. And so that word is the same word as Messiah. So Jesus Christ, Christ is not his last name. It's literally, if you were to put it in English, it would be Jesus the Messiah. Now, Peter's confession is the turning point in the story. Remember, we talked about how Mark leads up to this moment and away from it. And so far to this point, we've only seen Jesus in the Galilee. So throughout Mark's Gospels, he's been moving in and around the Sea of Galilee everywhere he goes. Jesus has not spoken one time so far about what is going to happen in Jerusalem. We do not know if the other disciples agreed with Peter's confession or not. It doesn't tell us anything about what the other disciples might have said, or whether Peter's representing all of them. We have no idea. But then Jesus' warning, though, after Peter's statement is quite clear. He says, do not tell anyone about him. Well, why would Jesus tell him that? Well, we'll soon see in just the very next verses, but it's enough to say that the Jews expected their Messiah to renew all of Israel and ultimately to destroy the Roman Empire. And so if this mantle of being the Messiah gets laid on Jesus too early or publicly, then the work of the suffering Messiah becomes challenging, if not impossible. So what happens next, in the next few verses, is a vindication of what Jesus' warning means, that Peter is, in many ways, and the disciples are well-intended in their recognition of Jesus as the Christ, but how they're going to hold that, at least for Peter, is wrong. And that's a key passageway for us to hear, that the decision about who Jesus is rests with each of us. Jesus' question to the disciples in this story is so powerful and telling. Who do you say that I am? So like those disciples long ago were asked the very same question by Jesus himself. To say he is the Christ is correct, but in our case, that confession of Jesus as the Christ lacks the same kind of history and context as those in the story. The Jews in Jesus' day were filled with messianic expectations. So acknowledging Jesus as Messiah, true as it is, had much, much more impact in the time in which Jesus conducted his earthly ministry, perhaps more so than it does now. So we don't really have any expectation of a Messiah who is coming to establish a military kingdom. We do expect Jesus to bring a reign of love and justice and truth and the destruction of all evil. It's very similar, but it's different. And so what we must think about here is when Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" that the answer to that question is more complex than just the Christ. So we have to find our own confession of Jesus. And to be honest, as we experience Jesus throughout our life, that name for Jesus changes based on the season of life in which we find ourselves, that there's going to be some moments where Jesus is Savior. There's going to be other moments where Jesus is Lord, moments where he might be friend, where he might be master, he might be king. I mean, we could go on and on with the titles. So we have to learn how to hold who Jesus is for us with a great degree of care. We turn to verses 31 to 33, and instead of the question of identity, we're focused now on the question of intention. We say that this passage is the pivot point, since it contains Peter's confession as well as Jesus' confession. Now in verse 31, Jesus then begins teaching them for the first time about his coming suffering in Jerusalem. This is the first time they've heard this, and it runs completely opposite of all of their notions around the Messiah. No one, disciples, religious leaders, even the people at large, no one expects a suffering Messiah. It is totally foreign to them. The fact that this suffering Messiah will happen through the rejection by religious leaders such as the chief priests, scribes, and elders that Jesus names says it all. Jesus does not just speak of his suffering, but he also speaks of his resurrection. His death is not the end. And so verse 32 makes it completely clear that Jesus is speaking plainly. He's speaking plainly. There's no mixed messages here. There's no parables. There's no kind of cryptic saying. Jesus speaks clearly about what is going to happen to him as a suffering Messiah. So the remainder of verse 32 becomes a bit more shocking. When Peter hears this, the same Peter who just confessed him to be the Christ, now Jesus has kind of turned the notion of being the Christ on end. Peter does two things. There's two verbs in verse 32 that are really important. The first one is that it said Peter took him aside. That word there for take doesn't just mean pulling him aside. It also means that to pull aside and give instruction in the same way a parent might pull a child aside to give them a correction or some kind of teaching moment. And then it says that Peter rebuked him. Now, that word for rebuke there in Greek is such an important word because it's the same word that's used to describe when Jesus rebukes demons or corrects leaders. And so the way the story is described in Mark is two very strong points of action here. Peter took him aside like he's going to correct him, and he rebuked him in the same way Jesus rebukes demons. Now, both of these verbs, very strong. They indicate that Peter feels the need to fix Jesus. One of the commentaries I have read in preparing for our podcast this week in the sermon is written by Lamar Williamson Jr., and he puts it best. Peter tries to behave like a patron, not a disciple. We'll hear more from Williamson in a moment, but Peter's appeal is not abnormal, but it's normal. No one expected the Messiah to suffer and die. resurrection regardless. Jesus turns and sees Peter and all the disciples, it says in the text, and he has an equally tough word for Peter. Jesus rebuked Peter. And again, it's that same word for rebuked, but now it's directed back at Peter. And he says, "Get behind me, Satan." Now, a lot of people wonder what this statement means, so let's see if we can clarify it a little bit. So the first part of it is get behind me. That behind is a corrective for Peter. So it literally means to follow. So Peter is hearing a word from Jesus that is designed to correct his behavior, that instead of Peter trying to lead Jesus to the right conclusion, Jesus tells Peter, no, wait a minute. You're the disciple here, so get behind me. In other words, get in the position of following me. And then he calls him Satan. Now, Satan is an interesting title because it's less of a proper noun, not like necessarily the Satan. Satan or Satan is a Jewish word, a Hebrew word, that's been kind of put into Greek letters. It's called a transliteration. It's like when you take the word and just represent the pronunciation of that word in a different language. And what Satan means in Hebrew is the accuser or the one who accuses. And so in this case, Peter is bringing an accusation against Jesus. So Jesus' hard word in front of the disciples is intended to highlight the danger of Peter's words. Now, what we have to recognize here is that although Jesus calls Peter Satan, and probably not thinking of the singular Satan, we have to remember that the rebuke that Peter's trying to bring is a pathway that Jesus has heard before. It's very similar to his temptation in the wilderness with the devil. And so Jesus could easily become the Messiah Peter wants. But if he did so, there would be no human redemption. Jesus makes this clear enough. He says, you are not setting your mind on God's purpose, but man's. Peter's well-intended and responds as any Jew would have responded, religious leaders even more so. Jesus makes it clear that this suffering Messiah is part of God's purpose, and Peter just can't see it yet. And that's a key passageway for us. Listening to the purpose of God requires us to let go of what we want to hear. Listening to the purpose of God requires us to let go of what we want to hear. You know, sympathy is a great deceiver when it comes to the purpose and will of God. God is at work doing something beyond our understanding. So how can we presume to tell God what to do? And so the lesson for Peter is our own. Let's go back to Dr. Williamson again, who writes this: disciples are not to guide, protect, or possess Jesus. They are to follow him. And that statement helps us understand what Jesus has said to Peter so clearly, and he says to us as well, that our work is to follow Jesus. Our job isn't to try to guide him, to protect him, or even to possess him. It's to follow him. I want to thank you for listening to this episode of the FFMC podcast and Passages. Listen in for our sermon podcast and our conversational podcast called Connections. You can find them right here in the FFMC podcast. I also encourage you to visit our church's website at ffmc.org to learn more about Free Methodism and how you can connect with our community. For now, I bid you all grace. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.